welcome to another episode of A Guide to B2B Podcasting. Today we're going to be talking all about how to create a podcast strategy and choose a podcast format. So we're going to walk through a lot of the different podcast formats, and while I'm going through those, I'm going to try to also talk about which formats and which kind of approaches are right for which types of businesses. All right, we're going to start off with the two primary formats, which are really focused on the mass appeal and branding type of podcast, and then the second one being the interview or networking approach to podcasting. These are your top two formats, and there's a lot of kind of derivatives and some others that we'll share after this, but I want to focus on these two first. So when I talk about kind of the creative mass appeal, the branding type approach, with this what I really mean is where you're focusing on really creating a podcast that is really engaging, really high quality. It is narrative. It is meant to really appeal to a wide audience and really create brand recognition for your business. Now, typically shows that fall into this category are going to require more heavy scripting than a lot of the other formats that we're going to talk about today. They might also require sound design. If you think about anything, that comes out of NPR or anything along these lines, this is the types of podcasts I'm talking about when I talk about a branding-focused podcast. With this podcasting, you're really aiming to try to get as many listeners and audience members as you can with this. This is the really primary goal of something like this. It's to, engage your community or to engage your customer base or attract new customers inbound by putting out really, really high quality, engaging content. Now, this is a really cool approach. It is a lot of work. It is also the most expensive type of podcast you can produce. I will tell you episodes in this style could range, if you were to do very kind of basic scripting, you might be able to get a show done for 6,000 to 8,000. And on the high end, there are episodes in this that could range, 30,000 plus, depending on how deep you want to go into this. If your episode's almost like a mini documentary. So very expensive to do. But for the right types of businesses, it can be a great approach. And so this is ideal for enterprises or people who have a large following, they have a community, they already have some level of audience built in. And so this is, something that if, you're an organization, we've had people that are coming to us that are wanting to utilize this style of approach for the diversity, equity, and inclusion campaigns, or things along these lines where it's really about quality, it's about telling this story, and they want less content, but they want a few really, really high quality pieces that engage people in a different medium. And so again, this type of podcast format, I would say, is best suited for large enterprises, people who have the budget that can do this style of show, and their goal is really to appeal to a large audience and really get that message and information out there. I will say that a show like this is really something where your goal is marketing and brand awareness, and you don't need a direct ROI. That's another kind of thing with a show like this is it's going to be hard to measure the direct impact of something like this. And so for smaller organizations, that can be harder to justify. But when a larger company that has budget for kind of brand awareness campaigns or this type of content, this is definitely something that you can look at. Okay, so that's our kind of mass appeal branding style podcast that we're going to go toward. And the second one here I want to hit on is interview-based podcast, really kind of this networking approach to podcasting. And I say that this one is definitely ideal for smaller business or mid-market companies, but it is viable at all levels. And the thing I'll share about sharing all these formats and these strategies is that you can mix and match all of these. You could have a mass appeal branding show that is interview based if you wanted to do something like that and keep it lower cost. That's still possible. But what is really interesting about interview based content is that it is much lower cost to produce than these NPR style really creative shows. You need less work on the scripting. There's some prep work, typically talking points, things like that. Sometimes certain guests, you can't even do prep work with them. They're just going to show up and talk because they're celebrity speakers, and that's how they roll. And so these things tend to take less pre-production and less post-production, which makes them much more affordable to produce on a whole. The other really amazing thing about interview-based approaches is that This show for, say, a smaller business or a mid-market company is really, really powerful from a networking angle. And so what I'm talking about that is, so imagine that your CEO or one of your, director of partnerships or one of your head of accounts is the host of this podcast. And they go out and they interview your ideal customers or the big influencers or potential strategic partners in your industry. And while they could, try to reach out to those people cold and try to get them onto a direct business meeting, the podcast becomes like this really warm introduction where you're saying, hey, do you want to come on my show? I'll expose you to our whole audience. I'll expose you to our business. I'm creating value for you. And then you kind of just start this really great business relationship in a really easy, low pressure way that is value first to the customer. And so this is one of our most kind of popular approaches that we do for a lot of smaller and mid-market businesses at Content Allies is we're going to create networking-based podcasts that are going to let you really almost use your podcast as account-based marketing, relationship building, and partnership building for your enterprise. And it's really cool, and it seems odd to be like, okay, well, the goal of podcasting is networking, but shouldn't it be the content? And yes, you are going to create amazing content as well, but networking is this amazing, I almost look at networking as the core value of an interview-based approach. And then all of the content you get off the back end of that, that's kind of like extra that's free on top of it. And so you're getting a chance to interview these people, have these amazing things, and then you create amazing podcasts, you create videos, you create social media content, you create articles and blog posts out of all of those. And so you're just getting so many amazing things in just this one frame of just basically interviewing people, sharing their expertise, and then turning that into tons and tons of different types of content. Interview-based approach, this is definitely one of my favorite kind of frameworks. But I will share kind of one caveat and one strategic thing to think about with this. And this is just a general podcasting best practice as well. But one of the biggest mistakes that we see people do whenever they're thinking about their podcast strategy or when they come to us and they want to start a podcast, a lot of times people will be like, they want to brand their podcast around what they do. I'll give you an example of this. So we had a client they're kind of a video storytelling agency. They do really high-end video work, and video storytelling is kind of like what they call themselves. And so they wanted to do this podcast around, video storytelling and the voice of the customer and all these kind of things like this, and really cool approach. But what the issue with that is, if you make your podcast around your domain of expertise, then no one's going to want to become a guest on that. So think about this. This company that does this video storytelling, customer storytelling, their customers are B2B tech marketers. And what I had to tell them was that if you guys create this video storytelling podcast, you guys can go on there and you can do solo shows, you can do monologues and talk about your expertise, but you're not going to be able to go out there and network. You're not going to be able to interview people because very few B2B marketers are going to say, I'm an expert in video storytelling. Let me come on your show. If you reach out and ask them, they're going to be like, well, that's odd. Like, that's what you guys do. I'm not the expert. I should be learning from you. And so this is kind of the biggest mistake, is where you make your podcast focused at your peers and your domain of expertise. The alternative to that is you look at what is the podcast, what is the interest for your customers, like who are your customers, and make a show that features and interviews them. So example, for this show, we actually ended up taking a different approach where we created a show that was particularly around tech marketing and interviewing basically leaders and the kind of innovators within the tech marketing space. And so now we've got a show that is useful to marketers in this kind of tech world, and it enables us to reach out and interview them for this as well. And so it's something that's networking, it's useful to them, and it's kind of gets all of those into one. And so again, that from the interview-based framework, that's one of the kind of biggest things that I always see people is whenever they want to interview, they brainstorm a show that's about their core thing. But really, you've got to brainstorm a show that's going to kind of feature and focus on your target customers, and that's what's going to attract them as well. Because, again, if you think about it, not many marketers are out there looking for, how do I get better at video storytelling? They're out there thinking, okay, how do I get better at marketing? And so you create a show for marketers, and then it just happens to be kind of sponsored by this video storytelling company, which pulls people into there. So you want to go kind of to their world and then pull them back down into your specific niche and area of focus. So I almost like to say, what do you do? What's one level above that? And that's a really good frame on how to think about designing an interview-based podcast strategy. One of the other kind of things I'll share on the flip side of that is actually the format that I'm using right now. And so we have a show called Leaders of B2B, which is very much that interview-based networking approach that we talked about. We interview B2B tech entrepreneurs, and it's really awesome. We get amazing content, amazing stories, and we also are just building an amazing kind of pool of relationships with all these companies in the B2B tech space. So that is kind of our interview-based networking approach. But we're also doing this series that you're listening to right now, a guide to B2B podcasting. And so the other really, really cool approach, and the way that I think that is relevant for companies, is to use podcasting for education. Basically, we started this series because we wanted a way to quickly create sales enablement and customer success content. And that's really the primary goals. And if it markets and attracts customers at the same time, that's awesome. But the goal of this educational series really was, okay, so think about this. If my sales team's like, hey, I would love sales enablement on this thing. I would love this on that. It's like, oh God, we got to go write an article or create something or all this stuff. And that's a lot of work. It becomes this project. They need this. Okay, customer success. We need stuff to train customers on, how to be good at interviewing or how to use their podcast microphones or stuff like this. All these things that just keep coming up, and we're like, we need content to support our customers or our sales process. I could, go try to just one-off create articles on all that, but why not use podcasting as medium? And so what we've done is we started this, and basically we just have a log of, okay, what are customers asking us? What are sales questions asking us? What's all the content we need? And we just show up, we record an episode just like what you're listening to right now, and then we take that podcast, we turn that into an article. We'll turn this into a video for YouTube and into a podcast and into social content. And what's really cool about that is that basically with very little time, we can just knock out sales enablement content and customer success content. And we've got almost a systematized way to do that. And that's what's really exciting about this medium is whenever you just have a conversation, out of just an interview or a solo thing like what I'm doing now, you can have someone else create the articles, have someone else create the videos, have someone else turn it into a podcast, into social content. And that feeds your customer success team, that feeds your sales team, and it feeds any really content needs you have as an organization. So this educational series one, really love this approach. What's also really cool about this is you don't have to think, I'm going to do this weekly forever. That could be an approach. Maybe that is something where there's enough education where you just keep going. But what you'll also see, one of the most popular podcasts out there, if you search startup podcasts, you'll see Seth Godin's startup school. And I love this and how he used the medium, where basically what Seth Godin did is he had a conference where he did a bunch of lectures and training on how to do a startup. This thing's almost 10 years old, and it's still one of the top rated startup podcasts out there. And there's only, I think, 14 episodes. And what it is it's just these series of kind of episodes that he did out there. It's just out there living now. It's almost like an audiobook, but it's just kind of a podcast format. And so he put this out there, and that's what I found really fascinating and interesting is you're using it where it's a medium, and it can just be an evergreen thing that just sits out there like an audiobook that just is there. It's something you always point to, but you don't have to do podcasting all the time. So many people think, podcasting, I have to just do this and then just go and go forever. And that is not true. You can choose a strategy in a medium where you put out a season or you just put out a series and then that stands alone and exists as it is. We've got another customer in the contextual advertising space. And so we're actually creating 2 shows for them. One, we're doing a basically crash course in contextual advertising because a lot of people listening probably don't know what that is. I didn't know what it was until we started working with them. And so it's going to be, a 6 to 10 episode series on contextual advertising that gives people the foundations. And then we're doing another one, Ad Tech Heroes, which is that networking interview-based approach where we're interviewing leaders in advertising technology. And so again, you can kind of mix and match these approaches at times and create some really cool stuff there. All right, so we've hit on the branding approach, the interview-based networking approach, and now the educational series. Those are going to say what I think are your most common podcast formats, or what I think are the most powerful. But I'm going to quickly run through a few more here before we wrap up. The next one is what I call a consulting-based podcast. And so this is one where typically this is really relevant for, say, consultants or people who are experts in their field. I'm not a big fan of this podcast format, but it's interesting. It works well for people that have a very large audience already, but there is a podcast out there called More Cheese, Less Whiskers by a really famous guy. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. And it is basically a podcast where people come on and he does marketing consulting with them live. And so they come to the show and they're like, hey, I've got this problem. I'm going to be launching this product. My brand isn't resonating with customers, or this thing's not working, or they come to him with a problem and it's like unscripted. And he's like, okay, we're going to do an hour-long consultation and you're going to get free consulting with me. It's going to be live broadcast out there. And so it's like a way to make him look like an expert while doing these live on-air consultings. It's a really cool format if you've got the audience, if you've got people that would love to get your expertise as a consultant. So if you've got someone who's a thought leader in the space, people are constantly wanting that person's time and attention to hear expertise from them, it's a great format for that. It doesn't give you the interview-based networking. You can't really reach out to people for it, but it does do a good job of positioning you as an expert if that is your goal and you've got an existing audience. Another format out there, one actually that I do kind of like, that we've got a couple podcasts that are running on this framework, is where basically you pull in a external host that is outside of your company and you interview internal team members. And so this is a really cool way. We've got a really large consulting firm where our podcast is going around and we interview their individual consultants in different areas of expertise to basically create content for them. And again, these are consultants and people that otherwise would probably not write blog posts or anything like that, but we're basically creating video content. We're creating articles. We are creating social media content out of this in the podcast. And it's kind of the way of having someone external basically go interview your experts within your company to create content. So really cool way. If you've got a lot of subject matter experts, this is another really popular approach for larger companies to basically just kind of pull in an expert and have them interview all of your internal team members. The next one here is, again, another format, and I wouldn't say this is not an overall show format, but more something that is done on a per episode basis. This could be mixed into any of the show formats we mentioned above. But that's really panel discussions where you're pulling in, I would say, up to 4 people on a podcast to have a discussion. I think that is a really just kind of great way to go, to kind of pull in different people and have a moderator who is basically kind of moderating a panel discussion. What I will say is, to do a panel podcast properly, you typically need to do some pre-level of scripting and talking points. A number of reasons for this. One is that it's easy for panels for one person to just kind of take over and run the whole thing. And you can have a moderator that tries to help with this and everything like that, and that's good. But while panels, I think, are good at conferences, it can be a little harder in a podcast format, because if you've got a rambler or someone who's over domineering, it's easy for someone to just tune out quickly. So you've got to be careful on that. The other reason that I think doing a bit more scripting on at least the talking points, who's going to hit on what points for a panel discussion, is relevant, is that it's hard in a podcast format to understand who is speaking when you start bringing 3 or 4 speakers on air. If you think about this, if you're at a conference and you go sit down in front of a panel, the host is like, oh, let me introduce each person, and you can visually see that person. Often they have a name tag or like a little nameplate in front of them, and it's pretty easy to know, okay, that guy's with this company, that girl's with this company, this is what everybody does. But in a podcast format, you're just kind of listening, and it's really a lot harder to discern who is speaking at what point in time. If you're not kind of scripting this and having the panelist or the moderator say, hey, so-and-so, based on your experience at so-and-so, what is that? What are your thoughts? It becomes hard if people are just kind of hopping in over each other and just discussing. While there can be great serendipitous things, it can be really challenging to understand and hear really who's talking and what they're talking about. So Panels, I think, are interesting, but in a podcast format, I do think it takes a little more pre-production than, say, a conference panel, which I think can go a little more free form. Another format you can look at is repurposing presentations from conferences. So this is another great way to look at it. Is there are podcasts out there that are just repurposed content from, say, like a conference or a live event. And so, what webinars, what conferences, or what presentations do you have that maybe could be utilized and just pushed out in another medium? That's something, again, that I would look at as another kind of medium, as possibly to look at. Again, it's possibly a whole podcast in itself, or it's just something that every once in a while, like, hey, we have this great piece of content. We could repurpose this and put this onto our podcast thread. So again, those are all great ones there. Another thing you'll see with that is sometimes when someone guest appears on someone else's podcast, so if someone at your company appears on someone else's podcast, you can often ask them for the audio, and they'll let you repost that on your own podcast thread. So you basically get a free episode because you appeared on someone else's podcast, they interviewed someone at your company, and now you can repost that on your own podcast. Most people are fine with that because it's going to give their podcast a little more exposure as well. So those are a lot of the primary formats and strategies that we go with. And I've tried to kind of hit where this works well and where this is. But again, I think your primary approaches, you've got the kind of creative mass appeal and branding approach for large enterprises who really just want that brand awareness. You've got the interview-based networking approach, which is ideal for small business and mid-market companies. And again, that can definitely be mixed into the mass appeal branding as well. So that's a very versatile approach there. And we've got the educational series, creating kind of a show similar to what you're listening to now. You've got the consulting-based podcast where you are the expert and people come on to basically consult with you and get all of your expertise and wisdom live on air. You basically have external hosts who are interviewing your internal team members to pull out their expertise. You've got panel discussions, you've got repurposing presentations or other podcasts, and those are really a lot of the primary mediums out there. Again, you can get creative with mediums, but I would say any other medium out there is going to be some mix and match of a variety of those. So that's what I would look at as your primary mediums here in terms of figuring out what the best strategy is. Like I said, if you're looking for ROI and you want to see revenue coming out of this, I think interview-based networking is going to be your highest ROI, highest value type of podcast for most companies, both large and small. I think even at larger enterprise, it's just a much more cost-effective approach than going the full NPR style route. And again, I think there are times to go that high-end creative podcast approach. Again, I think if you're doing that, you're probably wanting to aim for a shorter season of podcasts. You probably may or may not want to do that always ongoing, because this is the other thing I'll say for B2B podcasts is, trying to do this creative mass appeal branding. It's like you do this like NPR style shows. It's like, that's cool. But again, you're going to drop a ton of money on these things. Low end, probably $6,000 to $8,000 minimum, absolute minimum for like a really, really basic one, up to like $30,000 if you're doing like documentary style audio production. And so if you think about that, that's like a very good chunk of investment. While that's cool, it is difficult to justify unless you're trying to go for a really high mass appeal. Because the thing about podcasting is you're competing with consumer podcasts as well. Your podcast competition is not just other business podcasts. It is consumer podcasts out there. So you've got, Disney producing podcasts out there. You've got Amazon and Audible producing podcasts. And so you've got to think like, are you really going to be able to compete at that level? Or do you want to focus on really kind of trying to aim higher ROI? And I think where you're going to get better ROI is going kind of an interview-based approach, panel-based approaches, things like this where you're pulling in really big experts and your focus and your energy is around the production of curating experts in the B2B space and thought-leading conversations. My belief is that for B2B companies, that is more valuable than the NPR style show. Because again, I just don't think you're ever going to engage people as much as these consumer focused shows are and capture that. But if you've got really expert people sharing really expert thought leader stuff, that's what people are going to tune in for. They're not going to tune in for the production value. They're going to tune in to hear what the leaders in their industry are saying. That's what's going to tune people in B2B, and that's at least my belief and focus on strategy. So my biggest recommendation from most companies in B2B is something around the interview-based approach. You can get more scripting, you can get a bit more polished with it, but I think that in most cases, that is your primary best approach. And then I love the educational series as well as a way to create sales and customer success. I also love interviewing internal team members. But again, all the frameworks I'm sharing, they all tend to be interview focused, which I think is, in most cases, one of the best approaches for B2B. So as I mentioned, in the mass appeal, like there's some for diversity, equity, inclusion podcasts where you want to do a few really cool, high quality podcasts that engage the culture of your company. I think that's a great use for a creative kind of appeal of something here where you want a few really great quality pieces that are just going to engage and be like culture pieces within your organization. I think that's a better use case for that kind of creative mass appeal approach. That is a variety of tips on podcast strategy and everything here. If you want to just do a podcast consultation with me, talk strategy, try to come up with some ideas, I am happy to jam on this. Even prospective customers or anything like that. I love talking podcast strategy and just helping guide people in the right direction. So feel free to reach out to me at jake@contentallies.com, or you can learn all more about what we're doing over at contentallies.com. So thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.